In 1953, Catherine Dexter McCormick, heir to the McCormick family fortune, reconnected with her longtime friend Margaret Sanger. McCormick and Sanger met during their work in the women's rights movement. Sanger took McCormick on a tour of the Worcester Foundation for Experimental Biology in Massachusetts, where scientists were developing an oral contraceptive based on synthetic progesterone. Seeing that the researchers were close to a breakthrough, McCormick agreed to donate funds towards the work. The Worcester Foundation for Experimental Biology was founded by Gregory G. Pincus, a former assistant professor of general physiology at Harvard. For years, Pincus had explored his interest in human fertility, but he was not a feminist by any means. In a 1967 interview, he stated, "I am against women having sexual freedom, but I hasten to add that I am also opposed to sexual freedom among men." For Pincus, he wanted to show that biological processes, like reproduction, were the result of chemical interactions, and that if these chemicals were manipulated, the processes themselves could be controlled. In the 1930s, while working at Harvard, he conducted an experiment where he was able to make rabbit eggs develop into embryos without fertilization. Negative press in response to the experiment, as well as anti-Semitic attitudes at Harvard at the time, resulted in Pincus being denied tenure. In 1944, he started the Worcester Foundation to gain the financial independence and intellectual freedom to explore his interests. In 1945, a scientist named Min-Chua Chang received a fellowship to work at the foundation. Chang was a key part of the research to develop a contraceptive pill and would later go on to pioneer a new fertility technique called in vitro fertilization. Another man, Dr. John C. Rock, was very interested in the social implications of fertility. He studied gynecology at Harvard Medical School and afterwards opened fertility clinics around the Boston area. He eventually ended up working at the Free Hospital for Women, where his work brought him in contact with poor women who were desperate to find a solution for their infertility. Rock experimented with different combinations of estrogen and progesterone on these patients and was able to have some success. 13 of the 80 patients were able to become pregnant. In 1952, Dr. Rock and Gregory Pincus connected at a scientific conference and began to collaborate on experiments to reverse infertility using Rock's low-income patients as subjects. By this time, scientists had discovered that generations of Mexican women, descendants of Aztecs, had eaten a wild yam called cabeza de negro, or the barbasco root, as a means of contraception. Research confirmed that this yam contained progesterone, which could be extracted to create the first birth control pill. This led to the discovery of other non-animal sources for hormones, which made research with the chemicals cheaper than it had been previously. Anxieties about the rise of communism and the vestiges of the pre-World War II eugenics craze led to an increased interest in a supposed overpopulation crisis. Even though Dr. John Rock was a Catholic and the church vehemently opposed birth control, he justified his intent to create a reliable hormonal birth control option by appealing to his own belief that overpopulation, poverty, and death were all intertwined. Once Catherine McCormick stepped in to provide funding, Dr. Rock and Gregory Pincus were ready to leverage their years of experimentation to create the world's first anti-ovulation solution. They tested their different version on animals at first. Rats and rabbits were injected with high doses of hormones, allowed to copulate, and then had their fallopian tubes surgically removed so that the scientists could check for signs of egg fertilization. After years of these experiments, the research team identified a cocktail that they wanted to test on humans. In 1954, Pincus leveraged his contacts at Harvard and his ties with Catherine McCormick to gain access to mentally ill patients at Worcester State Hospital. Pincus misled officials about the intent of his research by telling him that he wanted to study whether his pills had a tranquilizing effect on humans. 16 female patients were given the pill, then Pincus sliced open their uteruses to observe the pill's effects. In 1956, a team of scientists led by Pincus performed testicular biopsies on 20 mentally ill men at the facility without anesthesia, claiming that the procedures were meant to study so-called castration anxiety. Other doctors objected to the methodology of these experiments, but Gregory Pincus was unfazed. The Nuremberg Code of 1947 which established an international standard for requiring patient consent during experimentation, did not have the force of law in the United States. Laws in the United States that would have made Pincus's behavior illegal were years away from being passed. After his experiments at the state hospital, Pincus was ready for a larger trial. Dr. Rock was in charge of finding a suitable location. Dr. Rock faced a challenge when trying to find a location for the trials. The trials couldn't be done in many places within the continental United States, since providing information about or access to birth control was often illegal. He needed a place where women of reproductive age could start the study and be monitored for a period of years, rather than a place where women often moved out of town for work opportunities or other reasons. Dr. Rock chose Puerto Rico. Puerto Rico had legalized contraception in the 1930s, and therefore there were various birth control clinics established on the island. Although most of the population in Puerto Rico was Catholic, people largely ignored the church's teachings on contraception and sought these services in light of their economic circumstances. Additionally, due to the influence of eugenics on the politics of the island, most women only had access to sterilization or abortion. They were eager for a temporary pregnancy prevention method. Dr. Rock and the other researchers saw the limited education and income of the population as an asset, since they wanted to demonstrate that using the pill was understandable and feasible for people at lower socioeconomic levels. Women participating in the study were required to be in good health and under 40 years old. They also had to have at least 2 children so that researchers knew they were fertile. They also had to agree to have a child if they became pregnant during the study. 256 women were recruited. Pincus remarked to Rock that the women were, quote, sufficiently intelligent, end quote, and that for them, pregnancy would be acceptable or at worst inconvenient. The trial started in April of 1956. The pill used for the studies contained high doses of progesterone. Small amounts of estrogen were added later. Dr. Idris Rice Ray, a faculty member at Puerto Rico Medical School and medical director of the Puerto Rico Family Planning Association, was placed in charge of the trials. After a year, she reported that the pill was 100% effective when taken properly. However, 17% of the participants complained of nausea, dizziness, headaches, stomach pain, and vomiting. Dr. Rice Ray told Gregory Pincus and John Rock that these symptoms were unacceptable. In fact, 25 women had withdrew from the trials because of the symptoms, and 3 women had died. These fatalities were never investigated to determine whether the pill had caused them. Dr. Rock and Gregory Pincus weren't alarmed by the reports from Dr. Rice Ray and the incidence of illness and death during the trial. In fact, they had seen similar rates of symptoms and dropout rates in the smaller trials they had conducted in the United States. They believed that the benefit of the pill outweighed the side effects and even the small chance of death. The researchers gave glowing reports to the FDA, and in 1957, the agency approved limited use of the pill. In 1959, after additional trials in Haiti, Mexico, and Puerto Rico, GD Searle Pharmaceutical Company, who had collaborated with Gregory Pincus for his research through his institute, appealed to the FDA for full approval. Pincus had purchased shares in the company at the beginning of their partnership. On June 23, 1960, the FDA approved the sale of the pill under the brand name Emboid. By 1965, 25% of married women under 45 had used the pill. By 1967, 13 million women in the world were using it. The pill was and still is one of the most important scientific breakthroughs of the 20th century. It changed the lives of women around the world by providing cheap, simple, and effective pregnancy prevention. However, the symptoms observed during the study began appearing amongst its new users. In 1961, 132 incidents of blood clots were reported. However, the FDA continued to allow the pill's use since the rate of these incidents were about 1.3 out of 100,000 compared to the rate of pregnancy-related deaths, which was about 36 out of 100,000. For the women of Puerto Rico who had endured months of painful testing, the benefits of the pill would not be realized. The final price of Emboid was 50 cents per day or $11 a month, an amount far too expensive for the majority of the poor people on the island. The women also had not received any compensation for their participation in the study. In 1968, 35% of all Puerto Rican women of childbearing age had been sterilized. In many cases, women were led to believe that their sterilization procedures were reversible, only to find out later they were not. Activists like Dr. Helen Rodriguez Trias fought hard to pass patient consent laws in the 1970s, which required that the patient be at least 21 years old, that the patient be told about other forms of contraception in her own language, that she'd have to sign a consent form, and then wait 30 days in case she wants to change her mind. However, even after these laws were passed, the rate of sterilization amongst Puerto Rican women remained high. In a 1987 article about Puerto Rico's history of sterilization, it was reported that 45% of Puerto Rican women were sterilized. Amongst New York City's Puerto Rican population, Puerto Rican women were twice as likely to be sterilized than Black women and 10 times more likely to be sterilized than white women. An inspection of the hospitals where these procedures were performed found that the facilities were in fact following every step of the patient consent law. Why then, after hearing about other options and having 30 days to decide, were Puerto Rican women choosing to be permanently sterilized? The answer lies in a complex web of historical, legal, and cultural realities. The economic desperation for some of Puerto Rico's women means that many refuse to trust the efficacy of hormonal birth control, fearing they could skip a pill and have an accidental pregnancy. Condoms are routinely rejected by women's sexual partners and have even lower efficacy rates than the pill. Abstinence is likewise not an acceptable option for married women. Abortion remains heavily restricted due to the influence of Catholicism. This all means that Puerto Rican women see permanent sterilization as their only option. After the FDA approved the pill, controversy about its symptoms became more widespread. The blood clots and stroke that had been ignored by the researchers when they tested the pill on Puerto Rican women were reported by women in the United States. A feminist activist and health journalist, Barbara Seaman, wrote a book called The Doctor's Case Against the Pill in 1969. Seaman and feminist advocacy groups did not oppose the use of oral contraception, but took issue with how the pill was being sold without adequate warnings to potential users. Wisconsin Senator Gaylord Nelson convened hearings to investigate these claims. As a result of the hearings, pamphlets detailing the symptoms of the birth control pill were required to be packaged with the pill itself. Eventually, the doses within the pill were reduced by the manufacturer, which decreased the occurrences of symptoms amongst its users. The ethics of the trials done in Puerto Rico were not examined or mentioned at all as a part of the hearings. The anti-abortion rights movement uses the story of the birth control pill to claim that it is dangerous and shouldn't be taken. In recent years, they found an unlikely ally: liberal health and wellness influencers whose obsession with homeopathic medicine and suspicion of institutions has led them to question mainstream medications. Both groups depend on the public's tendency to associate the word natural with the word healthy. At the same time, proponents of birth control like Margaret Sanger, Catherine McCormick, and Dr. John Rock view contraception through a paternalistic lens. They ignore the ability of poorer, less educated families to make choices for themselves and believe they have the right to make choices on their behalf. Margaret Sanger, for example, supported the Buck v. Bell Supreme Court decision, which allows so-called imbeciles to be sterilized. There is nothing wrong with non-hormonal birth control strategies like ovulation tracking, and nothing wrong with using medications. The issue has always been informed consent. Patients should be told about the trade-offs, risks, and side effects of medications. They should also be told about available alternatives. The dream of the birth control pill, enjoyed by millions of women around the world, should not be based on the nightmares of millions of disadvantaged others.